Imagine a man so consumed by delusion that he not only convinces others to follow him, but to abandon their families, their beliefs, and their very humanity. A man who, under the guise of salvation, becomes a tyrant, inflicting unimaginable cruelty and violence on those who trusted them. This is the chilling true story of Roch Thériault, a man who twisted faith and fear into a reign of terror that left a trail of broken lives. What drove him to this madness, and how did he maintain control over his followers long after the world should have intervened? Welcome to a story that will haunt you long after the final word. Roch Thériault was born on May 16, 1947 in Saguenay Valley, Quebec, Canada, to Hyacinthe and Pierrette Thériault. The second of 7 children, Roch grew up in a challenging environment. He later recalled that his father was abusive, with frequent beatings that left lasting scars on his childhood. However, as Roch grew older, he recanted these claims, leaving some ambiguity around the true nature of his early life. Despite these difficult circumstances, Roch showed a bright and intelligent nature from a young age. Unfortunately, at just 13 years old, he dropped out of school for reasons that remain unclear, marking the start of his tumultuous journey ahead. With plenty of time on his hands, Roch became consumed with thoughts of the apocalypse and the teachings of the Old Testament. Raised in a Catholic family, Roch eventually rejected his upbringing and converted to Seventh-day Adventism, abandoning a Catholic faith and its values in favor of a new, fervent belief. Enthusiastic about his newfound faith, he actively promoted it, finding success in distributing Seventh-day Adventist literature through door-to-door campaigns. Over time, Roch attracted a small but devoted group of spiritual seekers eager to follow him. By the mid-1970s, Roch's following had grown, and he had become increasingly convinced that he was chosen by God to save the world from the looming apocalypse. A charismatic and powerful speaker, Roch proclaimed himself a prophet, urging his followers to devote themselves entirely to his mission. His ultimate goal was to establish a commune deep in the Canadian wilderness, where he and his followers could live in harmony, free from the corruption of the outside world. But this idealistic vision came with a dark demand. His followers were required to sever all ties with their families, as they were seen as tainted by the very corruption Roch sought to escape. In 1978, Roch made a prediction to his followers. He claimed the world would end in a shower of boulder-like hailstones. To protect themselves from this impending disaster, Roch convinced his small group of followers, 4 men, 9 women, and 4 children, that they must relocate to the Eternal Mountain, a secluded plot of land near the village of St. Hugues in the Gaspésie region of Quebec. Together, they became known as the Holy Moses Mountain family, pooling around $2,000 in welfare and family allowances each month to build them a commune out of tents and log cabins deep in the forest. However, when the apocalypse failed to materialize, Roch's response was to lie to his followers, claiming that the prophecy had not come true due to discrepancies between the Israelite and Gregorian calendars. But deceit was not the most alarming aspect of life within Roch's commune. To consolidate his power and expand his influence, Roch took an unsettling approach. He married and impregnated every woman in the group. Over time, he fathered 20 children with 9 different women. At the same time, his fixation on medicine took a disturbing turn. After undergoing surgery to treat his stomach ulcers, Roch became obsessed with performing medical procedures on his followers. Believing that he could conduct these operations while intoxicated, Roch began to administer questionable, and often dangerous, medical interventions on cult members, further cementing his control over them. In 1981, Roch's obsession with medical procedures led to a horrifying event. When 2-year-old commune member Samuel Gugeri began complaining of difficulty urinating, Roch decided to perform an operation without hesitation. Armed with a pair of scissors, he located Samuel and cut his genitals. The painful and traumatic procedure caused Samuel to break into tears, a reaction that only enraged Roch. In response, he ordered fellow cult member Guy Veer to beat the child until he stopped crying. Tragically, the horror didn't end there. Samuel's condition worsened rapidly, and he slipped into critical condition. The commune members, terrified of Roch's wrath and unable to get aid from the hospital, tried to save Samuel's life. Despite their efforts, the young boy died from a combination of the botched surgery and the beating he endured. In a chilling attempt to conceal their actions, Samuel's body was set on fire and hidden. When Roch learned of Samuel's death, his fury knew no bounds. Seeking someone to blame, he turned on Veer, holding him responsible for the tragedy. In a cruel act of retribution, Roch castrated Veer himself. To further cover up their crimes, Roch instructed his followers to lie to any outsiders, claiming that Veer had been trampled by a horse. However, rumors soon began to spread about a boy's death at Roch's commune, and the police launched a raid. During their investigation, they discovered Samuel's remains and learned of Roch's brutal punishment of Veer. Roch, along with 5 other cult members, were arrested. He was found guilty of criminal negligence and causing bodily harm, and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Veer, deemed legally insane, was not found guilty. The remaining cult members arrested during the raid received lesser sentences, with most only serving a few months. The shocking events at the Eternal Mountain Commune exposed the dangers of Roch's twisted beliefs and the devastating consequences of his control over his followers. This, however, was all short-lived. Roch's reign of terror continued even after his release from prison. Defying a court order that barred him from rejoining his followers, Roch immediately returned to them and, in 1984, established a 200-acre commune near the Burnt River in Ontario. Here, he solidified his control over an even larger group, ruling over 26 children, most of whom were his own, and a number of concubines. Despite the horrific conditions and brutal treatment, Roch's followers remained disturbingly loyal, refusing to abandon him. Like his previous commune at the Eternal Mountain, the new compound consisted of log cabins and tents. But this time, Roch's followers were able to sustain themselves more comfortably by producing and selling various goods, including preserves, maple syrup, bread, and smoked fish at local markets. Roch, intoxicated by the efforts of his followers, dubbed them the Anthill Kids, comparing their tireless work ethic to ants diligently building up their colony. Yet, as before, dark rumors began to circulate around the compound, and the situation deteriorated even further. By this point, Roch had become a severe alcoholic, and his behavior grew ever more erratic with each drunken episode. He exerted his power over the cult members through increasingly sadistic commands, prohibiting certain followers from speaking to each other, forcing gladiatorial tournaments, and doling out beatings at will. His paranoia grew stronger with every passing day. Roch became convinced that some of his followers were spying on him or planning to leave, which triggered violent outbursts. Always carrying a hammer, and eventually upgrading to an axe, he would strike anyone he suspected of betraying him. The violence was almost lethal on multiple occasions, with several cult members narrowly escaping death as Roch used the flat side of his axe to punish them, driven by delusions of betrayal. The terror within Roch's commune only escalated as his paranoia deepened. With each passing day, his punishments grew more sadistic and arbitrary. To prove their loyalty to Roch, members were sometimes ordered to break their own legs with sledgehammers. Failure to do so would result in brutal punishment. If Roch wasn't in the mood for such a spectacle, he would command other cruel tasks, making followers sit on lit stoves, forcing them to shoot each other in non-lethal areas, smearing each other with feces, or even slicing off each other's toes. It seemed there was no end to the horror of which Roch could conceive. On top of this, Roch claimed the right to have sex with anyone in the compound, and found perverse pleasure in watching his partners eat their own feces. The situation finally drew the attention of authorities after a devastating tragedy in 1987. Gabrielle Lavelle, a member of the commune, left her child outside in the freezing cold of a blizzard, where the child tragically succumbed to the elements. When questioned, Gabrielle explained that she had left her child outside in a desperate attempt to avoid Roch's violent outbursts. This heartbreaking incident led to the removal of 14 children from Roch's compound, who were placed into foster care for their safety. Despite the increased scrutiny from the police, the abuse within the compound continued. By this point, only 2 men and 8 women remained loyal to Roch, their lives twisted by the oppressive and violent grip he held over them. Yet, even as the authorities closed in, Roch's reign of terror showed no signs of stopping. After the incident with police, Roch's rage and cruelty intensified. Each time he became drunk, his violent outbursts escalated into more horrific acts of punishment. In one particularly disturbing instance, Roch decided to play doctor again. He ordered that a rubber band be placed around the testicles of one of his male followers. After 8 agonizing hours, the man's scrotum became severely swollen and infected. Without any form of anesthesia, Roch took matters into his own hands. He cut open the swollen area, removed a testicle, and, to make matters worse, cauterized the wound with a hot iron. The excruciating procedure only added to the suffering and fear that permeated life within Roch's commune. In another harrowing incident, Roch, deeply intoxicated, overheard 32-year-old Solange Boulliard complain of stomach issues. Reacting swiftly, Roch forced her onto the kitchen table, stripped her naked, and initiated a barbaric enema procedure. He muffled her screams with a cloth, inserted a plastic tube into her rectum, and poured a mixture of molasses and olive oil. Following this, Roch made a brutal incision on the right side of her abdomen, removed a piece of her intestine, and commanded another cult member, Gabrielle, to stitch her up. Simultaneously, he ordered another cult member to blow into a tube he had inserted down Solange's throat. Solange died the next day. Unfazed by her death, Roch claimed he possessed the power of resurrection and would bring Solange back to life. As part of his miracle, he instructed a cult member to remove Solange's uterus and a portion of her skull. Approaching her lifeless body, Roch then ejaculated onto her exposed brain, an act which predictably did not revive her. Without success, he quickly arranged for her burial on commune grounds. Before internment, however, Roch removed some of her ribs, which he wore around his neck in a leather case he made. As macabre souvenirs, he also distributed pieces of her ribcage among the cult members who assisted in this gruesome ritual. In November of 1988, Roch performed yet another violent act when Gabrielle complained of a toothache. True to his disturbing nature, he violently extracted several of her teeth, then chased her around the commune with a knife, slashing at her hand and severing one of the tendons. Desperate and in pain, Gabrielle sought medical attention and was admitted to the hospital, where doctors inserted a wire into her right hand to stabilize the injury. Despite the brutal abuse, Gabrielle made the heart-wrenching decision to return to Roch's commune, but only on the condition that he would stop drinking. Sadly, that fragile promise was short-lived. In July of 1989, Gabrielle once again found herself the target of Roch's unthinkable cruelty. After complaining about stiffness in one of her fingers, an intoxicated Roch responded with savage violence, impaling her hand with a knife on the kitchen table. But the torture didn't stop there. Roch decided that the entire arm had to be removed. Methodically, he hacked at her arm with a series of knives, each cut pushing into Gabrielle an unimaginable agony as she screamed and cried on the floor. The next morning, a fellow cult member stitched her stump. But Roch wasn't satisfied with the crude effort. He insisted the wound needed to be cauterized. Using a blowtorch and a piece of an old drive shaft, he seared the wound shut, leaving Gabrielle's body and soul further broken. A month later, on August 16th, 1989, Gabrielle managed a desperate escape, fleeing into the wilderness to escape her tormentor. She found her way to a hospital just north of Toronto, where she sought help once again. Just days later, on August 23rd, Roch's commune was raided by police. Tragically, Roch and 3 of his followers had already fled. It wouldn't be until 51 days later, on October 6th, that they were finally apprehended. Roch ultimately pleaded guilty to 3 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of unlawfully causing bodily harm, receiving a 12-year sentence for his horrific crimes. However, his fate took a darker turn when a cult member helped police locate the body of Solange Bulliard. This discovery led to the upgrading of his charges to second-degree murder, and Roch was sentenced to life in prison. In prison, Roch's time behind bars was far from peaceful. He frequently complained about being abused by his fellow inmates. According to his lawyer, René Millet, the assaults had nothing to do with how he acted while incarcerated. It was because of his past. Roch himself admitted to fearing for his safety, haunted by the very legacy of violence he had created. But his violent life would end in the most brutal of ways. In February of 2011, Roch was stabbed in the neck by his cellmate, Matthew Gerard MacDonald. After carrying out the attack, MacDonald calmly approached a prison guard, dropped his bloody knife, and said, "That piece of shit is down on the range." Roch succumbed to his injuries before paramedics could even reach him, his life extinguished in a moment of violent justice. Roch Thériault's story is a horrifying tale of manipulation, violence, and delusion. It serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the capacity for cruelty that can arise from such authority. His reign of terror left deep scars on those who survived, and his legacy is a dark chapter in the history of cults and psychological abuse.
If you liked that video, please consider leaving a like and a thumbs up, and if you have any suggestions for future videos or ways that we can improve, please leave them in the comments below. With that, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in the next video.